The night they called my name, my father was holding a glass of Barola that costs more than my first month's rent. I watched it happen from 40 feet away. I watched the exact moment my name traveled across that glass-walled room and reached him. His hand stopped. The conversation he was having with the man in a navy suit simply ceased to exist. The color left his face the way water leaves a cracked vessel, slowly at first, then all at once. Marco Cruz, self-made, loud at dinner tables, quiet when it counted. A man who had spent 4 years telling anyone who would listen that his eldest daughter Isabella was the future of Cruz development. He was not in that room for me. He did not even know I was nominated. That was entirely by design. This is not a revenge story. Revenge implies I spent 4 years thinking about him. Obviously, I did not have the time. This is accounting, a precise record of what it costs to build yourself from nothing inside a family that already decided you were worth nothing. I was 26, sitting in my father's study in Buckhead, holding an acceptance letter from Georgia Tech's School of Architecture. The room smelled of Cuban cigars, expensive leather, and the metallic undertone of a man who measured every room he entered for its resale potential. Marco Cruz did not decorate for comfort. He decorated to signal. The bookshelves held architecture books he had never opened. The desk was imported Italian walnut, chosen to communicate permanence to anyone sitting on the wrong side of it. I was always on the wrong side of it. My sister, Isabella, sat beside me, 29, polished in the way women are polished when they have never had to wash their own dishes consistently. Her posture was deliberate. She held her own envelope from Emery's Gosueta school uplist with the casual confidence of a woman who already knew the outcome. She did know. They had discussed it without me. My mother, Renata, sat near the window, adjusting her bracelet with the focused attention of a woman who had perfected the art of being present without being accountable. She did not look at me when I walked in. Marco opened his leather portfolio, not dramatically, with the quiet authority of a man who had already decided and now was presenting documentation. The firm's liquidity, he began, is currently allocated toward 3 active projects in Cobb County. We have capacity to fund 1 graduate program. He looked at Isabella. We are funding the MBA. The sentence sat in the room like furniture no one had ordered. I looked at the acceptance letter in my hands. Georgia Tech School of Architecture, one of the most rigorous design programs in the Southeast. I had applied 3 times over 5 years. The first 2 rejections had sharpened me into something the 3rd application could not ignore. Marco continued. His reasoning was built like a project proposal. Isabella demonstrated consistent networking capability and social intelligence that mapped directly onto the firm's growth trajectory. He intended to bring her in as junior partner within 2 years. Your architecture degree, he said without raising his voice, is an artistic pursuit with an unclear return on investment. Architects work for developers. I am a developer. The math is straightforward. He closed the portfolio. You are welcome to pursue the program on your own terms, Catherine. I am not dismissing your ambition. I am simply being honest about where the family's capital produces the most reliable yield. I sat in that chair for 3 more seconds. I counted them. I picked up my acceptance letter, folded it precisely in half, ran my thumbnail along the crease until it was sharp and exact, and tucked it inside my jacket against my chest. I thanked him for his clarity. I walked out. Outside, the Atlanta air was thick and warm. I did not cry. I calculated. The federal loan maximum for my program classification was significant but insufficient. The gap between what the government would lend and what Georgia Tech required made my stomach contract. I had $3,200 saved over 18 months of 20-hour work weeks. No cosigner, no safety net, an acceptance letter folded against my heart, and a father who had just told me in the language he trusted most that I was not worth the investment. I stood up. I drove back to Decatur. I opened my laptop and began to build the financial architecture of my own survival. The mechanics of funding a graduate architecture program without family support are not romantic. There is no montage. There is only exhausting arithmetic. I maximized my federal loans. I secured 2 partial departmental scholarships covering 18% of annual tuition. I negotiated 28 hours a week at a midtown drafting firm. I moved to a smaller apartment, 300 square feet smaller, with a kitchen that shared wall space with the bathroom. The rent was $340 less per month. I calculated that figure against a 6.8% interest rate and signed the lease the same afternoon. I ate with strategic precision. I found a secondhand French press at a Decatur estate sale for $4. I commuted 40 minutes each way on MARTA because I could not afford the parking permit. And I studied, with the focused desperation of a woman who understood that every grade, every submission, every studio critique was a brick in a structure that had to hold the weight of everything my father had refused to carry. Isabella, during this same period, lived 3 blocks from Emory in a midtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a monthly grocery delivery Marco had set up on a recurring billing cycle. She began attending industry events with Marco and Antonio Vespa, his wealthy Italian-American business partner of 15 years, whose particular kind of wealth does not advertise itself because it does not need to. Isabella posted photographs from rooftop venues and charity galas, captioned with language about the grind and the hustle. I watched these posts the way you watch weather patterns, clinically, for information. I did not feel envy. Envy requires believing the other person has something you want. What Isabella had was borrowed gravity. She was orbiting my father's money and calling it momentum. I knew, with the cold certainty of someone teaching herself structural engineering at 1 a.m, that borrowed gravity eventually fails. Dr. Camille Fontaine was not a warm woman. She was precise the way a properly calibrated instrument is precise, completely reliable, and entirely uninterested in your feelings about its accuracy. Our first major project was a site analysis and adaptive reuse proposal for a blighted corridor in southwest Atlanta. Most of my cohort approached it as a design problem. They produced beautiful, technically accomplished proposals with the clean elegance of work produced by people who had never had to think about where the nearest affordable grocery store was in relation to a bus line. I approached it differently. I had ridden the MARTA line at 6 a.m. alongside the people these proposals were theoretically serving. I understood that a beautiful building in the wrong location with the wrong access points is not a solution. It is an aesthetic imposition. I built my proposal around those people. Transit corridors first, grocery access radius, distance to the nearest elementary school, urgent care clinic, laundromat. Then I designed around those maps. Dr. Fontaine reached my drafting table during the critique and stopped. She did not speak for 4 minutes. She studied the site analysis maps, the programmatic breakdown, the elevations. Then she looked at me over her glasses. "You are thinking like someone who has had to solve real problems." Her voice was entirely neutral. "Keep doing that." She moved to the next table. I packed my portfolio, walked down 4 flights, across the parking structure to the 3rd level where I had locked my bicycle to a concrete pillar, and sat on the cold concrete floor for 20 minutes. It was the first time in my professional life that someone in authority had looked at the specific way my circumstances had shaped my thinking and called it an asset. I sat there for 20 minutes. Then I got on my bicycle and rode home in the Atlanta dark. Let me tell you something about the golden child that nobody wants to hear. She is not your enemy. She is a warning. She is what happens when a person is never required to develop the musculature of survival. When someone else's money fills every gap before the gap can teach her anything. And when real pressure arrives, the actual pressure of being required to produce something from the inside rather than the outside, she fractures, privately first. Then she turns to the person she has always turned to when something needs absorbing. That person, in my family, was always me. It started with calls from Marco. "Catherine," he would begin, his voice carrying the cadence of a man who had already decided the conversation's purpose before dialing. "I spoke with your sister. She sounded stressed. I need you to check on her." I would be standing in my kitchen eating reheated rice, studio materials spread across the table behind me, a deadline 48 hours away. I would listen to my father describe Isabella's stress with the focused concern he had never once directed at mine. "I understand," I would say. "I will call her." And I would, because I was still operating under the ingrained architecture of my family's dysfunction. I had been the designated shock absorber since I was old enough to understand that my mother's first loyalty was to household peace, and my father's first loyalty was to his own narrative. It did not feel like self-destruction, it felt like maintenance. Isabella and I began meeting twice a week, at her apartment, because the drive to Midtown was easier for me, apparently, than the drive to Decatur was for her. I would arrive after studio hours, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been concentrating at a cellular level for 8 hours, and sit at her glass dining table, helping her organize case study materials, restructure analysis frameworks, build the logical architecture for arguments she had never been required to develop independently. I told myself it was temporary. I was lying to myself with practiced fluency. The deadline I missed was for a mid-semester structural systems submission worth 22% of my studio grade. I had spent the previous night rebuilding Isabella's analytical framework for a supply chain case study due the following morning. I arrived intending to stay 2 hours. I left at 2:15 because her panic had escalated in direct proportion to my attempts to leave, and I had not yet developed the psychological muscle required to walk out of a room where someone I loved was genuinely falling apart. I drove home. I opened the structural systems file. I calculated the hours available against hours required. The numbers did not resolve. I submitted an incomplete assignment at 7:45 and walked into the studio with the hollow steadiness of a person running on 2 hours of sleep and the specific shame of knowing exactly whose failure they had just subsidized with their own. In Dr. Fontaine's office, the incomplete submission sat between us on the desk. This is not the work of someone who does not understand the material. This is the work of someone who ran out of time in a specific and deliberate way. I did not explain. Explaining would have required me to name Isabella. I cannot advocate for someone who is not advocating for themselves. Redo the load calculations, complete submission on my desk by Friday at 5. Do not let this happen again. I walked out into the second-floor bathroom, stood at the sink with cold water running over my wrists for 3 minutes, not crying, recalibrating, identifying the precise point at which my loyalty to my family's comfort had become a structural threat to my own future. I identified it. I noted it. I went back to the studio and worked until midnight. Dr. Fontaine marked the resubmission with one annotation in red pen in the margin. "This is what I expected. Do not make me wait for it again." I kept that page. I still have it. The theft did not announce itself. That is the thing about betrayal inside a family system. It does not arrive with dramatic clarity. It arrives quietly, disguised as a favor, wearing the face of someone who loves you. Isabella's MBA capstone required an urban development proposal for a blighted commercial corridor in southwest Atlanta. The strategic and financial components were within her capability. What she did not have, what her team did not have, was the spatial and architectural vision. A mixed-use proposal without a coherent physical framework is a spreadsheet pretending to be a strategy. She called on a Wednesday evening, warm, sisterly. Val, I just need rough sketches, a conceptual framework, nothing formal. Just something to give the proposal a visual anchor. You can do it in your sleep, 1 hour. I was at my drafting table, 3 projects in various stages, behind on 2. I said I would do some preliminary sketches. I spent 4 hours on them. Not because the task required 4 hours, but because I am constitutionally incapable of producing work I am not proud of, even when I should not be producing it at all. I developed a full conceptual framework for the corridor's adaptive reuse potential, 3 programmatic scenarios with annotated rationale, transit integration logic mapped and notated, clean, rigorous, genuinely good, because that is the only way I know how to work. I sent the files at 11:40. Isabella replied with heart emojis and a message saying I was the best sister alive. 3 weeks later, I was in the Georgia Tech Library when I found her capstone abstract in the Goizueta Showcase Index, Integrated Revitalization Framework for Atlanta's Southwest Commercial Corridor. The abstract described a mixed-use development strategy anchored by a conceptual spatial framework prioritizing transit-oriented density, programmatic flexibility, and community infrastructure integration. Those were my words. That was my logic, my annotated rationale, restructured into the passive voice of an MBA abstract and attributed entirely to Isabella's team. No acknowledgement, no footnote, no mention of my name anywhere in the document. Antonio Vespa had been so impressed by the spatial vision that he communicated to Marco his interest in offering Isabella a junior consulting role within his investment group. Marco had called me 2 days prior, warm in the unfamiliar way he became warm when something had gone well for Isabella. He told me she had impressed Vespa significantly. He told me he was proud of how she had performed. He did not ask how my semester was going. I closed the abstract index. I drove to Isabella's apartment and knocked on her door. She knew when she opened it. I could see it in the half-second of calculation behind her eyes before her expression settled into something trying to be innocent and landing closer to braced. I walked past her. I set my bag on her glass coffee table. I placed the printed abstract beside it. I did not raise my voice. I inherited nothing useful from Marco Cruz except his capacity for absolute stillness at the moment of maximum consequence. Her defense assembled in stages. First, confusion, performed poorly, then minimization, just sketches, just a visual anchor. Nobody in an MBA showcase evaluates the architecture rigorously. Then the pivot to her own suffering, the impossible capstone timeline, the cruelty of requiring spatial thinking from students trained exclusively in financial modeling. Then came the weapon she had been holding in reserve. Her eyes filled, not with grief, with strategy. Val, her voice dropped to the register she used when she needed me to feel responsible for her pain. If this comes out, it's not just me, it's the whole family. Dad's relationship with Vespa is built on this. Vespa pulls the offer, Marco loses a major development partnership. You would be burning everything down. For credit on some sketches? The room was quiet. I looked at my sister, the woman who had watched the same father open the same ledger and make the same calculations about our relative worth, and who had responded by learning to extract value from the one person in the family who had never learned to withhold it. Something clarified inside me. Not anger. Clarity is what remains after anger burns off and leaves only the precise shape of what is true. I am not going to the university, I said. I let the relief begin to form on her face. Then I continued. Not because you deserve my silence, because an academic tribunal would consume months I do not have and damage my record alongside yours. I will not sacrifice my future a second time to manage the consequences of your choices. I placed a second document on the table beside the abstract. You are going to sign this. A written acknowledgement, notarized, confirming that the architectural framework in your capstone originated with me. She would never use my work, my name, my methodology, or my professional relationships for any purpose without my explicit written consent. She stared at it. "We are sisters," she said quietly. "We are. And tomorrow morning we are going to a notary, and you are going to sign that document. And then I am going to go back to my studio and finish the 2 projects I am behind on because I spent 4 hours building the foundation of your professional debut." She signed it the following morning at 9:15 at a UPS store on Peachtree Street. The notary was a tired-looking man in his 50s who stamped it without reading it. Isabella wore sunglasses. She did not speak to me in the car on the way there or back. I dropped her at her apartment, drove to campus, locked my bicycle to the concrete pillar on the 3rd level, and walked into the studio. I had 2 projects due in 72 hours. I sat at my drafting table. I opened the first file. I began to work. The Atlanta morning came through the studio windows in long, flat lines of light. For the first time in a very long time, every hour I spent working belonged entirely to me. There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside a person who has stopped waiting for permission to exist. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of someone who has finally understood that the argument was never the point. The point was always the work. The slow, unglamorous, solitary construction of something so structurally sound that no ledger could touch it. I found that silence in the 2nd semester of my final year. Dr. Fontaine called me into her office one evening in late October. The building was mostly empty. She finished reading a file, closed it, and looked at me. "I am nominating your thesis project for the Southeastern Emerging Architect Commendation." She held my eyes. "I need your complete documentation package in 5 weeks, everything at the standard I know you're capable of, not the standard you produced when you are managing other people's emergencies." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. She had been watching me navigate my family's gravitational pull for 2 years without naming it directly. "I will have everything to you in 5 weeks," I said. I was at the door when she spoke again, without looking up. "Valentina, the commendation committee does not need your story. They need your work. Make sure the work is the loudest thing in that room." I held those words the entire 40-minute ride home on the MARTA line. The city moved past the windows in streaks of light. My work, not my survival, my work. I did not answer Markle's calls about Isabella. I let them go to voicemail and responded with brief texts. Critical thesis period, unavailable. Marco did not press. He had begun sensing a shift in our family's tectonic plates without identifying its origin. Isabella did not call. The notarized document in my filing cabinet functioned as an invisible structural wall between her world and mine that neither of us needed to reference because we both knew exactly where it stood. My thesis was a full adaptive reuse proposal for a blighted industrial corridor in Southwest Atlanta. The same conceptual territory from my first-year submission, the one that made Dr. Fontaine stop at my drafting table for 4 minutes. But where that project had been instinctive and rough, the thesis was rigorous and complete. 460 pages, site history, community infrastructure analysis, structural assessment, 3 programmatic scenarios with full construction cost modeling, transit integration framework, 12 interviews with Southwest Atlanta residents conducted on my own time. It was the best work I had ever produced. It was the first thing in my life that was entirely, structurally, irrevocably mine. No one had funded it. No ledger entry had approved its existence. The commendation notification arrived by email on a Thursday morning while I was eating breakfast. Dear Ms. Cruz, we are pleased to inform you that your thesis project has been selected as this year's recipient of the Southeastern Emerging Architect Commendation.
I read it twice, set my coffee down, sat at my kitchen table surrounded by 4 years of deliberate, grinding survival. The secondhand furniture, the drafting table pushed against the window for natural light, the filing cabinet holding, among other things, a notarized document on the third shelf. Not triumph. Triumph is loud and immediate. This was quieter. The feeling of a structure that has been bearing load for years, finally being recognized as load-bearing. The feeling of a calculation coming correct. I confirmed my attendance. I told no one. The Meridian Tower on the 14th was everything Atlanta does when it decides to be impressive. 32nd floor, glass walls on 3 sides, the full ecosystem of the built environment assembled in one room. Developers, architects, engineers, investors, city planners. I arrived early. I was directed to the honoree table. I ordered sparkling water. I watched the room fill. I saw Marco at 8:14. He came through the main entrance with Antonio Vespa and 2 other men, all moving with the collective ease of people who attend rooms like this regularly enough that the room no longer impresses them. Marco was laughing at something, a glass of Barolo in his hand. He looked exactly like what he was, a buckhead patriarch in his natural habitat. He did not see me. The honoree table was screened from the entrance by a tall floral arrangement. He drifted toward the bar and settled into the comfort of a man who is exactly where he expects to be. The program director stepped to the microphone at 8:30. She spoke about the commendation's 30-year history. She spoke about this year's submissions and the committee's most unanimous decision in 5 years. She spoke about a proposal that was not just architecturally sound, but humanly necessary, built by someone who had ridden the transit lines, who had sat in the living rooms of the people the building was supposed to serve. This is a designer, she said, who built her thesis without institutional resources, without a professional network, and without the financial foundation that makes these years easier for some than for others. The committee did not award this commendation to her story. We awarded it to her work. But we want to be clear. The work and the circumstances that forged it are inseparable. I saw the moment reach Marco before the words did. The slight collective reorientation of bodies around him pulled his attention toward the microphone. The Southeastern Emerging Architect Commendation is awarded this year to Valentina Cruz. I stood up. I walked the 40 feet at an even pace, heels steady, the room coming into full sound around me. Applause. 300 people reorienting their attention toward a single point. I did not look toward the bar. I walked to the stage, climbed the 3 steps, shook Dr. Suarez's hand, and accepted the commendation with both hands, the way you accept something you have carried for 4 years, in the form of loan payments, and MARTA commutes, and studio nights, and a notarized document in a filing cabinet in a small Decatur apartment. I turned toward the room. In my peripheral vision, near the bar to the left of the stage, a glass of Barolo went completely still. I said thank you to the committee, to Dr. Fontaine, seated in the 3rd row, who received the acknowledgement with one composed nod that contained, if you knew how to read her, the closest thing to warmth she publicly expressed. I spoke about the Southwest Atlanta corridor and the residents who had given me their time and their specific knowledge of what their community needed. I told the room that the most important design education I received happened outside the building, in the neighborhoods this city had decided to overlook, and that the only meaningful architecture begins by listening. I did not mention my family. The omission was its own statement. The one person who needed to understand it understood it most of all. Marco found me 20 minutes later near the window. He looked older, not dramatically, just the particular aging that happens to a man when the narrative he has built his identity around develops structural cracks he cannot repair with spin and selective investment. He was holding his Barolo glass, but not drinking from it, holding it the way people hold things when they need something to do with their hands. That was extraordinary work, he said carefully. The committee clearly recognized something exceptional. A pause.
"Your mother and I are proud. I should have paid closer attention." He was not apologizing. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters in an accounting. He was repositioning. A developer standing before an asset that had appreciated beyond his original projection, attempting to renegotiate his stake without acknowledging he had voluntarily divested 4 years ago.
I let him finish. 4 years ago, you sat behind your desk and told me the family's capital produces the most reliable yield when invested in Isabella, I said, quietly, without heat. You made a calculation. I have spent 4 years understanding it very thoroughly. He opened his mouth. I am not finished. He closed it. You were right that I would build something. You were wrong about why. I did not build this to prove your calculation incorrect. I built it because it needed to be built, and I was the one who could build it. The commendation is mine. The work is mine. The debt I am carrying to have done this work is mine. Every single part of this belongs exclusively to me. I picked up the commendation. I genuinely wish you well with Isabella's learning curve. I turned to Rafael Moreno, my colleague who had been standing quietly beside me. He was already reaching for his jacket. We walked together toward the elevator without looking back. The doors opened. We stepped inside. They closed. The city below was lit and indifferent and vast. I held the commendation against my chest and exhaled a breath that felt like it had been building for 4 years. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Isabella. No preamble, no greeting, just a screenshot. It was an email thread between her and Antonio Vespa, 3 months old. In it, Vespa had asked about the architectural framework, specifically whether she could elaborate on the transit integration logic, and Isabella, in her response, had written 6 words I had to read 3 times before they fully registered. My sister, Valentina, designed the framework. She had told him, months before the commendation, before the notarized document, before that night. Below the screenshot, she had typed 1 line. Vespa called me last week. He wants to offer you the consulting role. He said he always invests in the architect, not the drawing. I stood in the elevator with the commendation against my chest and the city falling away beneath me. And I understood for the first time that the accounting was more complicated than I had calculated. I had built something structurally sound. I had protected it. I had defended it. But Isabella, the woman I had written off as borrowed gravity, had, in her own quiet way, made sure the room knew my name. I did not call her that night. I needed to sit with what it meant to be wrong about someone you thought you had finally figured out. But I kept the document, notarized, 3rd shelf. In this life, clarity and forgiveness can coexist. They do not cancel each other out. You build anyway. You protect your work. You exhale when the calculation comes correct. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person you least expected is the one who made sure the room knew your name. Thank you for listening to this story of mine. I would appreciate it if you could subscribe to this channel to help me grow it into a bigger community where I share real-life stories and people's life experiences. If you enjoyed the story, give it a thumbs up. And if you do not like the story, tell me in the comments section where you feel it didn't make any sense. Inasmuch as I see your comments, I would respond to it. Do you have a story to share with me and have it posted in this community? Indicate in the comments so I can connect with you. Once again, I appreciate you all. See you in my next upload. I love you all.